101 kind of presentation because I expect that you've been to a few Frank Lloyd Wright buildings or at least know a bit about him. However, if you want to ask questions, certainly do that are more about sort of basics of his biography and his work. I'm happy to take those at the end as well. I like to start with Frank Lloyd Wright's work on the Monona Terrace project. He designed it for 21 years, 1938 to 1959. He had 8 designs for the project, and we know he was paid only $250. So this was not a lucrative project for Frank Lloyd Wright. It was, in fact, a labor of love for him. And so part of the early part of my presentation will explore why he did this work on such a labor of love. We have to start with Wright's relationship with Madison. He considered Madison his hometown, and he was spending his boyhood ages 9 to 19 in Madison. Here we have a photograph of young Frank on the left side at age 9. He was a typical boy doing a lot of recreational activities in Madison as a kid. He and his friends would go to ice boating races. We have a historic image illustration here of one on Lake Monona in Madison with the Capitol in the background. He also had a printing press that he and his friends would not only just play with, but produce printed material. And of course, we know that he played with blocks. And these blocks that are pictured in the right part of your screen are called Freuble blocks. They were a gift from Frank Lloyd Wright's mother at age 9, and they were like his Legos. He talked in his autobiography quite a bit about the Freuble blocks because he said that in playing with these blocks, he started to look at the world around him very differently. In fact, he started to see shapes underlying everything. The Freuble blocks were designed by a German educator named Friedrich Freuble, and he's credited with starting kindergarten in Germany, which of course later spread out to all parts of the globe. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright's relationship with his mother was certainly an important one. She was a mom who got very involved. She hung pictures of cathedrals around her child's nursery. So no doubt she wanted him to be an architect. And she came from quite a large family called the Lloyd Joneses, who had immigrated here from Wales. They stopped in New York when they arrived and then eventually made their way to rural Wisconsin, a place called Wyoming Valley. And they were a bunch of farmers, teachers, a preacher who were Unitarians. They, in fact, had immigrated because of religious persecution, and they were very strong in their faith and very fierce in their convictions. In fact, the Lloyd Jones family motto was truth against the world. And when I tell you that, it does kind of put a lens on his formative years in terms of growing up with a really fiercely independent bunch. His time visiting family in the Valley was important. His exposure to that particular landscape on nature walks, play in the outdoors was important. And we know that these formative experiences as a child would be part of his development as an architect. He was known for what he called organic architecture. And it's a bit of a loosey-goosey term in that we know that Frank Lloyd Wright himself defined organic architecture in several different ways. I've put some of those ideas here now, buildings that are in harmony with and draw inspiration from the environment. American design, so design that does not look to Europe for inspiration. And architecture that's appropriate to time, place, and people. So we'll be looking at examples of what we're talking about here in upcoming slides. If we can digress from the Monona Terrace and Madison story for a moment, I'd like to share just a couple of slides of Frank Lloyd Wright's home, Taliesin. As many of you, if not all of you know, Frank Lloyd Wright left Madison as a young man to work in Chicago and had a lot of success in the Chicago area. Did some of his most important work there, certainly with prairie houses. But as you also may know, he had some personal distractions. And he, in fact, had a family at home, a wife and 6 children, but did have an affair with a client and left Chicago to go to this land that his Lloyd Jones ancestors had settled in Wyoming Valley. This is near Spring Green, to build a house for himself and Mamah Cheney. And this is Taliesin. So we have these beautiful photographs now that come from drone imagery. This is one of them, which gives you a nice aerial shot at the house. I bet some of you have probably visited. And the home is a big complex, but it was meant to accommodate his family as well as farm buildings. And what we see here is the wing that's the living quarters with living room, bedrooms, and a long bird walk, as you see. Now, the name Taliesin is derived from Welsh, as a tip of the hat to his ancestors, and it means shining brows. So here I tried to give you a perspective of being on the top of the hill that Taliesin is built on. So if you imagine that in the bottom right corner of your screen, you would be standing at the hilltop, and there would be a few steps that would take you down towards the entrance to the house, which is in the center of the screen. And in fact, you're looking down below you, the house is wrapped around the hill. Taliesin is Welsh for shining brow. So the house was the shining brow of that particular hilltop. Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, thought this was important to create a harmonious relationship with this house and the hill, not to dominate the landscape. And here, a couple of ideas at work in Frank Lloyd Wright's living room, these ideas of organic architecture that we'll see embodied later at Monona Terrace. First of all, though not evident from this slide, you would have come into the house under a shorter ceiling. It's a little over 6 feet in Taliesin. Some people bump their heads. And you walk into this space, the living room, and it opens up to you. So there's this sense of what Wright would call compression and release. The space is confined, and then it's almost an explosion of openness and freedom. And this effect is also achieved by the band of windows that you see. Now, those of you living in Chicago, of course, know the beautiful art glass that Wright did in Chicago. In the prairie houses, and many people who come and visit Taliesin from that area say, you know, where's the stained glass? But Wright didn't want any element of design that would cover the view. It's absolutely fantastic. So it's just simple plate glass windows here. So back to Madison, we're going to start with the year 1938. And Wright is already 61 years old. And he's done some work in Madison already. From his base at Taliesin, he's worked on a few residences in Madison. We see the Jacobs House in the top left corner, considered his first Usonian home. We'll mention that a bit more in the future. And what is really considered Madison's only prairie house, the Gilmore House at the bottom of the screen. It's also called the airplane house because when you look at it from above, it's got kind of a crucifix form. And then on the right side, the lamp house that was designed and built for his childhood friend, Robbie Lamp. Eventually, there would be 10 Wright designed structures in Madison. This is another well-known building in Wright's work that happens to be in Madison, the Unitarian Meeting House. So growing up Unitarian, of course, he was in that community. We have a very large Unitarian congregation here in Madison. In fact, so large that they've added to the historic Wright building with a newer design dating about 10 years old. But this is the Frank Lloyd Wright part of the structure we're seeing here with its beautiful prow. And I bring up these properties because Wright is starting to make relationships that could either help him or in some cases might hurt him. But the Unitarian congregation was very supportive of Wright and absolutely passionate about this church, to the extent that they ran out of money for contractors to bring the rock from the quarry to the site. So the congregation themselves did it with their trucks. So they all volunteered and brought the rock in. What I also want to say about 1938 is that it was a particularly good time for Frank Lloyd Wright in his career. So taking more of a national view of his work at the start of the Monona Terrace project, in the late 30s, Wright was experiencing a bit of a renaissance. He had a kind of a fallow period during the Depression and came out of it with a real boom, because he was designing projects that really put him on the map. Falling Water, of course, is the most famous. That is near Pittsburgh. And then I bring in Johnson Wax Administration Building here in Wisconsin, in Racine, as a very important company project. That's the great workroom that we see there. And I also duplicated the Jacobs 1 slide because this one was important in his career as the first built Usonian house. So in the late 30s now, he was moving away from prairie homes and towards this idea of more middle income houses that were smaller in size, less expensive materials. The client was often the young family who could ideally help in the construction. So this Jacobs house is an important property in Wright's career. And also, he's on the cover of Time magazine in 1938, so he's kind of a big deal. So it is against this backdrop of Wright being very busy that this Madison project comes along. Frank Lloyd Wright meets with a citizen named Paul Harloff, who says, you know, I've seen some of the proposals for government offices in downtown Madison. I don't think any of them are very good. Would you consider throwing your idea into the ring? Here's the site that we are looking at. So in this lovely bird's eye view that captures the isthmus of downtown Madison, we see Lake Mendota in the background, Lake Monona in the foreground, and the state capitol building, as you can see, majestically in the center of it all. I'm not sure you'll see my cursor, but this is the site we're talking about that is planned for a project which would eventually be called Monona Terrace. And now a more contemporary photo of this landscape, more built up, of course, over the years. I think this dates back to the 80s, but still this shoreline kind of missed opportunity, used a little bit of a park landscape, but also a parking lot. Oh my goodness! And so this is the site we're talking about. So Frank Lloyd Wright comes in as kind of a late to the party contestant, you might say, but he is absolutely captivated by the idea of designing Monona Terrace, and he starts to sketch. Now, there are stories about Frank Lloyd Wright shaking beautiful designs out of his sleeve, as he likes to say, but this one has a rough kind of a cocktail napkin sketch on it, which does show from the very beginning that Wright was thinking about a semicircular kind of design with these two mouse ears, we call them, with our 4th grade classes, but drums on either side here. And eventually, of course, this would become a formal plan in 1938. Here we see the program of the building: government offices, courts, and guess what? The jails did have views of the lake, those lucky inmates. And also here, Wright had planned for a boat marina and a train station. He was really trying to do it all in this building. The reality was that this did have some traction in the late 30s, but of course World War II was around the corner. And that time completely halted the project. So of course, as materials and labor were being diverted to the war efforts, this was just not going to happen through the 1940s. I wanted to pop up this little image of the Capitol Dome to begin the conversation that Wright, in fact, acknowledges that he chose circular forms for Monona Terrace because of the Capitol Dome. So in his effort to place the building into the site, into the urban environment, he wanted to connect through shape. And we'll see more examples of that. So the project is picked up again in the 50s. So through this period now, those government offices with courthouses were in fact now progressing in a different track. Wright was not involved. So the attention turned to that same site on the lakefront as being a civic auditorium project. So throughout the 50s now, we're moving away from the municipal courthouse building and towards an auditorium. And what I love about this drawing from Wright is that the Capitol Dome is in the background, and you see these similar dome-like forms on the roof of Monona Terrace. He called them sun, moon, and earth, and they were to be sort of glowing orbs, kind of science fiction looking. And we'll see more examples as we go. So Wright really was in a different situation than usual. He is known for his residential designs. He is known for working with families. He has less experience in 1938 and later in the 50s working with many clients, including city government, state government, county government, and the citizens. So he is really having to demonstrate a flexibility that really he had never had to do before. We don't associate flexibility with Frank Lloyd Wright usually, but in fact, we see that he is willing to make changes to get this thing moving. He's here before a group of county supervisors in this image. And his perspective or point of view on the project was this, that Madison should not build structures that turn their backs on the lake. And he had already criticized the city for that very thing, that they were putting up projects that were just not taking advantage of this beautiful natural landscape. And he also thought that this building should be grand and it should be kind of a mega structure. So he was looking at many, many purposes housed within one structure. His price tag was $17 million. And he said, this is an idea that would raise Madison from the ranks of mediocrity. Now, when we look at the other side of the coin, he was a polarizing figure who had some supporters, but unfortunately, within the ranks of government, he had quite a few enemies. Some of the arguments over the years were that Wright's design did not meet all of the city's needs, that the design would block the lake view. The city cannot afford to pay $17 million. Sorry, Frank, this is a $4 million budget. And that he had, been insulted by the folks that were making the decisions had been personally insulted by Wright. He did not have a filter, as we love about him. So he said what he thought, and oftentimes he was, in fact, insulting the very people that he needed to really impress and win over. So it was, in fact, the case that though there was a referendum that passed in the 50s to build Monona Terrace, there was a piece of legislature that killed the project in 1957, and Frank Lloyd Wright died 2 years later. So Wright would not live to see Monona Terrace happen. Fast forward 30 years, and enter Tony Putnam. This gentleman was an apprentice with Wright in the 50s, and in fact, one of his first projects at Taliesin was working on the Monona Terrace model. And he was considered the perfect person to look into the feasibility of a convention center, now a convention center on the shores of Lake Monona. Tony's job was to take Wright's exterior design, here in the drawing above, 1959, the last one Wright worked on before he passed away, and to redesign the interior as a convention center. And I put these two next to each other so you can see that he in fact fulfilled that mission of preserving the exterior. You see the 7 arching windows facing the lake. You see spiraling kind of Guggenheim-esque parking ramps. it is in fact very, very close to the original footprint and exterior design. And here we are today in 1997, opening as a convention center. So when you do that math, that's nearly 60 years, 59, since Wright began working on the Monona Terrace project. And here we have a great drone view that shows a gathering on the rooftop, probably from the looks of it, one of our free community concerts that we offer during the summer. Not this summer, unfortunately, but hopefully in the future, and have for many years. So Wright has, and later Tony, successfully embedded this property into a site that has an urban landscape on one side, and of course this beautiful natural landscape on the other. Well, let's go back. So if you kind of land your eyeballs on the center of the slide, in the walkway that leads from Monona Terrace to the street going up to the Capitol, if you imagine yourself standing there and looking in both directions, on the left side here of the screen is the Monona Terrace view you would have, and on the right side, the state capitol. And the reason I placed these two images next to each other is so that you do get a sense of what Wright had tried to accomplish in connecting Monona Terrace to the state capitol building. Now, we all know that Wright didn't love Greek columns and a lot of ornament, that was not going to be his connection. His connection was going to be shape. So that dome, that prominent dome of the Capitol, is employed in many different ways, which we'll see here. There's a curved roofline projection that you can see at Monona Terrace, as well as a dome turned upside down, if you will, operating as the saucer on our rooftop. And also rather unusual for Frank Lloyd Wright is the fact that the building's symmetrical. So he was not one to typically do that in his designs, but here he wanted to, again, kind of echo the Capitol's two wings that are extending, and the slide to the right. And if you can imagine, you would take ramps up to the rooftop on either side of these doors here at Monona Terrace. So two wings flanking the building. Tony wanted to respect Wright's interest in the interior dome-like skylights here. So on the left side, our state capitol dome. By the way, the architect is George Post, and it just celebrated its 100th birthday. It's a beautiful building. If you're coming to see us, please go to the state capitol as well. But of course, a very grand and neoclassical dome on the left, and on the right, Wright's intended skylight here, concentric circles and a skylight at the top, very much like the Guggenheim Museum, and just beautiful in its simplicity. So when you come into our doors, this is the main entrance, and it's full of circle-based items and furnishings all around you. Two-dimensionally, of course, in the carpet design and the signage on the wall, and we have three-dimensionally put planters and saucers and curved lines everywhere, arcs at the top above your head as you walk in. So we are intending to show you right away when you come into the door that our geometry is curvilinear, and we aren't going to let you forget it. Now here is what you see if you look ahead to the hallway when you walk in the main entrance. And as you can see, it's inviting. You know, there's a light that's coming through the window at the end of the hallway. That particular window is centered beautifully before you, and it is calling to you. So many people immediately want to walk in that direction and see what is happening once they've moved down this barrel vaulted space. I've got a short video with a disclaimer that I was able to get into the building and myself use my phone to make a little video here. It's not great, but it does, I think, communicate something because we're moving through space, which is in fact really how we should be talking about architecture. So I'm going to play it and narrate a little as we go. So we're walking towards the space we call the Grand Terrace, and there are meeting rooms on either side of the hallway. When I filmed this, I saw Renee, my coworker, and I thought, oh no, get out of the frame. But in fact, I'm glad that she walked out, not knowing I was filming, but it does show you the scale of that ceiling. We have a dropped ceiling at the entrance to the room, and this is our compression release, not 6 feet, because we have to follow building codes and we're like 8 feet, but nonetheless, the drama is still there. So you come under the ceiling plane and you walk into the room, and majestic views, big open space. This is a room that was empty because we were closed at the time I filmed, but it's a very popular room with our convention center clients doing weddings, meetings, meals in this space. 7 windows that have a terrific view of Lake Monona. What do you think? Am I up for an Oscar for cinematography? Probably not. I'm gonna let this play just a little longer so that you get the look back at the hallway. This is more of a professional shot of the Grand Terrace, but it does show you, again, an example of those windows that connect us to the outdoors. Wright was known for his glass walls, window walls, and we are fortunate to have much of that at Monona Terrace. We're at the top of the building here in the Grand Terrace, but you'll see examples as we move further in lower levels. And it's just a tremendous place to be no matter what the weather is doing outside. And one more view of that space. As we move down to the second level, we have another meeting space that has a lakefront placing and a beautiful view of the lake. But I wanted to point out this room particularly as an example of the breaking the box idea. You know, Tony had a bit of a challenge because if you know a little about Wright and how he approached interiors, you know that he loved open floor plans and wanted one space to sort of flow into the next. But a convention center, by its very nature, encloses people. It creates privacy for those who rent these spaces. So Tony had to kind of reconcile some of that throughout the building. And one way that he did it here was to create a wall of glass so that, in fact, the people inside do feel like they've got their own room. But for those of us on the outside of the room, we can occasionally take a peek and see all the way through to the lake view. And here's the inside of that room. Very popular for weddings. With the enclosing wall here, they can have a DJ and amplify sound in this room. Another kind of unique space for a convention center is a small auditorium. And I say that because, of course, it's always beneficial when you have a space that you can convert to other seating arrangements to be flexible for your clients. However, one thing that remained throughout the 21 years of Wright's design on the project was this notion that he wanted a little theater. This was something that he was kind of stuck on. I've noticed that plans for the Guggenheim included a little theater too. And we decided to stay true to that. So Tony designed something that had a fixed floor plan that was intended for lectures, films, speaking engagements, and this is our lecture hall. You can see that the circle form is also outlined in terms of speakers in the ceiling and ventilation on the bottom of the stage. And of course, we had a little bit of money in the budget for custom furniture pieces. We're now looking at a small boardroom, workroom space, and it also has this tremendous lake view. But I'll put your attention to the table in the center. This table is about 14 feet long and echoes the lines of the shape of the room itself. So it is in fact just perfect for the room that it occupies. We had another gentleman working with Tony Putnam. His name was Aubrey Banks, and he was an interior designer who had worked at the fellowship at Taliesin and designed a few custom pieces for us at Monona Terrace. This is cherry, by the way, in case you're interested in wood. Another nice view of the arcs that greet you when you walk into the main entrance. And a little closer view of the podium on the stage in the lecture hall. That was also an Aubrey Banks project. He said it was quite challenging to try to put the curved line into the form of the podium, and he did a beautiful job. It's really an elegant piece. Again, cherry wood. And we have a few slides in succession here that are rooftop slides. Wright, of course, was very interested in how furnishings can complete the total environment. And so Tony was just picking up on that organic philosophy of how you don't just stop at the walls and the guts of the building, but rather extending the shape all the way through the structure, Wright calling it geometric grammar, with the circle being our grammar at Monona Terrace, of course. So these spheres do light up in the evening. On the left side, you see some of the lighting that we use in the evening and cast upon the saucer shape as well as in the sphere. And yes, we have a crazy carpet that also uses curved lines and forms in it, kind of a chevron shape, you might say, fan shape. And we know that Wright designed textiles. We know that he liked to take something from nature often and abstract it. So Tony had wanted to do a carpet design for us, which over 3 carpets through our 22-year existence has always incorporated this chevron element. So I don't know if any of you were guessing what from nature was abstracted here, but it was the ginkgo leaf. So when you walk in, it's quite a busy carpet. It needs to be. We have a lot of people walking on it, spilling wine and so forth, but it's got this beautiful pattern that repeats itself. And Tony chose warm colors too, I should say, because as you can imagine, the view outdoors is quite blue by virtue of the water, or more of a white or gray, depending on what the weather's doing. And our walls are neutral. They're kind of a beige color. So the warm colors are really meant to liven up the space. Now we have here a shot that's not giving the space justice, but this is a shot of our exhibition hall, which is 39,000 square feet. And that is our largest space for things like trade shows and banquets. And we have air walls that will divide the spaces so that we can be flexible to our customers' sizes and needs. A little bit about our relationship with the lake. Monona Terrace is built 90 feet out over Lake Monona. And so construction starting in the winter of 1994, we see our contractors going out and with kind of a jack system, embedding steel pilings through the ice and down to hit bedrock at the bottom of Lake Monona. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright's known for cantilevered spaces, very dramatic projections. We're safely engineered. We have 1,700 steel pilings that are supporting our weight. So you can imagine there was a lot of this going on well over a year, the embedding of the pilings. This is one of the best views you can get from a boat. Coming up on Monona Terrace. And I like this slide because it does do something that other slides don't illustrate. I think that you can get a sense of the fact that Wright was successful at somehow creating a sense that the building was floating. And it's made of concrete, so it's certainly not a light material, but nonetheless, you notice that and Tony later recessed the columns of support down here at the bottom of the building under the scallops and under that projecting planter. And it does create this appearance of what was called pendentive, which is that there's like a hanging, floating quality to the building. And here's one of those projecting arches over the window, which does help to reduce glare and sun inside and protect the furnishings and so forth. Of course, our lakefront facing building would not be complete without a bike path. We in Madison love our bicycles. Before Monona Terrace was built, it did have a lakeshore path for bicycles and pedestrians. So there was no way we were not going to include that. And we have a really wonderful 3-lane bike path that, believe it or not, accommodates bicycles and pedestrians and people fishing, all kinds of things. And we have a bike elevator. So we added a freight size elevator to one side of our building. You don't need to enter Monona Terrace to use it. It's really accessible from the parking lots and the bike path. And you can take this to different street levels in Madison. Now our rooftop, Wright had great vision for it. He saw it as a gathering place, and he saw it as a place of beautiful water features. You'll remember early in the presentation, I mentioned the trio of fountains. He called them Sun, Moon, and Earth. And you see them here. These were saucers with spheres inside, poles emanating from them, lit up, water pumping over them, really dramatic. Believe it or not, the little dots of white that you see sprinkled throughout this design are car headlights. So Wright at one time had imagined that Monona Terrace would project some 200 feet into the lake and have a drive around it, which is kind of hard to imagine now, of course, especially in this day and age when we're reducing traffic, hopefully. But in Wright's day, of course, in the 50s, people were really interested in the car as a part of design, and he was no exception, and he loved cars. Here's the roof as we built it. Guess what? Fountains are pretty expensive, and we had the money to do just one. So we don't have 3 fountains, but one in the center, as you see there. And we were able to do that, in fact, through a very generous gift from a community member who had started the American Girl Doll Company. Her name is Pleasant Rowland, and she gave $500,000 so that we could build this fountain in the center, which is really wonderful. You do, however, see the trio is at play in form, even though there are not 3 fountains. You can see that there is a sort of a triangle of cylinder shapes with spheres on top that are kind of for looks, and in some cases have air conditioner chillers in them, but nonetheless create that same appearance. Just a short video that takes you up to the rooftop that I'll play here. The day that I was filming, we were actually preparing planter beds for new trees to go in. Some of our trees are diseased, and we really need every bit of shade that we can get up here, as you can imagine. So we have redbud trees that are going in, well, have gone in the last couple of weeks or so. And our landscape guy has really done a wonderful job with some perennials that are prairie perennials, natural, local. But it's April when I shot this, so pretty bare bones. I'm going to let this play long enough so that you can see the view to the Capitol here. Frank Lloyd Wright referred to Monona Terrace as the long-awaited wedding between downtown Madison and beautiful Lake Monona. And I think this is where you get the strongest sense of that no matter where you look, it's a great view. You may have noticed the paver tiles in that video, and here's just a quick shot to show you how the roof was put together. Of course, it's exposed to all elements, so when rain and snow fall, they fall in the cracks between the pavers. The pavers are not grouted together, but they do rest on these pedestals. When the precipitation happens, it drains off. It hits that subfloor and is drained off so as not to create any kind of moisture threat for us. But because we can't haul heavy snow removal equipment up there, we are closed during the winter on the roof. Just another beauty shot that I like, so I included this. A few more slides will show you what events look like. I didn't want to give you just shots of empty rooms, because in reality, if you were to come and visit Monona Terrace, you would encounter many things happening throughout the building. And this is our ballroom, and you can see an event here with an Alice in Wonderland theme. And a wedding set, which was quite dramatic, so we all took photographs of it. Large size work meetings with jumbo screens. Here again, our exhibition hall, but this time we wanted to show that not only could trucks drive in and deliver things to the building, but they could actually occupy some floor space here as part of a show. I mentioned we do community events. While we're on hold for this year, it's a typical year we would do 100, and those would include everything from yoga and meditation to special events like this one, Moon over Monona Terrace. Our local astronomical society brings these great telescopes, and we look at the moon and planets and stars. A spectacular community event that unfortunately I don't think happens anymore in Madison, called Kites on Ice, where you would go right out onto the frozen lake and fly these fabulous, very large, kind of Macy's parade size kites. So as we were preparing our Zoom presentations for kids, I started to think about how everybody's working at home and they've got their kitchen table set up. Wright, of course, is here at his workspace, and he's at Taliesin West, a campus that he would put up in the late 30s and spend his winters, about 20 years of his life, in Arizona. And you can see surrounding him are projects he's working on. He's 91 in this photo, but he does have his collection of shells as a reminder of his inspiration. So shortly before this photograph was taken in the year 1958, one of his apprentices had asked him, well, what do you think is going to happen to Monona Terrace? Is that really going to work out? Because at that point, it was sort of a suspended project. And Wright said, you know, I think it will happen, maybe in the next 10 years, and Madison will build it someday. So I lift that quote because certainly the man had a healthy self-esteem and believed that his work would carry on. And though he was incorrect about the timeline of 10 years, add a few more decades to that, he knew that Madison would see the value of what he had given them. And it's interesting that throughout the country, other unbuilt projects have been built. So Monona Terrace is by no means the only one. When we opened, we published our marketing materials and called ourselves the final masterpiece. But in reality, Wright's unbuilt designs are being built in various places, and really stand as testament to the fact that his ideas are still appealing to people. So he remains a viable designer for folks today. And with our last beauty shot here, I'll close and take any questions you might have.
Heather, that was fascinating. Really fascinating. Thank you so much. So we do have quite a few questions, and I'm going to try and get through as many of them as we can. First, what does Monona mean?
So I've heard two interpretations, but they're both Ojibwe language. We have the two lakes, Mendota and Monona, and one is small and large, one interpretation, and the other is grand and beautiful. So take your pick.
Someone commented that there isn't a lot of art on the walls in the spaces, and there's not a lot of plants or foliage either.
Yeah, the slides I picked, that's true. Although when you come and visit, which I hope you'll do in the future, we have several exhibits on the walls. Some of you might have heard of Pedro Guerrero. He was Wright's personal photographer. We've got some of his work on our walls that's just gorgeous. We've got some panoramic photographs of Madison landmarks. And we also, about 6 years ago now, put up a small exhibit about the history of our building. So if you go and you haven't timed your visit to take the tour that we offer, you can go and learn more about quite a bit of what I've just told you, but also some great photographs and a model down there as well. So that certainly is true of the slides I showed, but we do have some things that people can see besides the architecture.
You pointed out the table, the cherry table in the conference room. Were the pieces of furniture also designed by Wright?
So Frank Lloyd Wright never got far enough along in the process to design furnishings for inside the building. So unfortunately, unlike say Marin County Civic Center out in California, which did have some Wright specific designs for interiors, we didn't have any of that. So when we started as a convention center, we were looking out kind of on the market for what we could purchase and use as furnishings, and also go to Aubrey and have some custom pieces designed.
So one question came from someone who is a native Madisonian. His grandparents immigrated from Europe, so there are deep roots there, but he lives in Chicago now. And he seems to recall that at some point Monona was going to be built on the other side, like near the Alliance Center. Is that true?
He may be referring to what kind of evolved after Wright died. So Wright died and left behind a group of his apprentices that formed an architecture firm. And that architecture firm stayed sort of in play in terms of proposing waterfront plans, one of which would have included a building like this, but then extended all the way down the lakeshore. So it was a much sort of bigger scope. And I think that might be what he's referring to. That would have been in the 60s.
The interior ceilings and floors have similarities to the Sydney Opera House. Was Frank Lloyd Wright and that architect, did they influence each other? Did they know each other?
Wow. I've never had that question and I don't know the answer. That's interesting. I don't know. I wish I could say that I could make that comparison firsthand, but I've never been to Sydney. So, however, there's a great, apparently there's a great documentary you can watch about the making of the Sydney Opera House. Sorry, don't know.
So are you able to alter the design of Monona Terrace in any way, upgrading it according to technological advances, or is it the structure is the structure and you can't make any changes?
That's a great question. And because we are this kind of a bit of a hybrid, as I call it, part Wright, part Tony, we don't have that historic preservation kind of mandate. And yes, we haven't really changed spaces. What we have done though is, as your question alludes to, technological upgrades. Of course, in the 20-some years we've been on the planet, there have been strides in wireless internet and so on and so forth. Also over those 20 years, we can't sometimes get the same chairs that we got in 1997, so we need to adapt. So we are kind of, we treat it like, let's try to be sensitive to Wright's designs and our choices, but we do have to change it sometimes.
What was the final cost of Monona Terrace?
Thank you. $67 million. So the tussle in the 50s was between 4 and 17, and of course in 1990s prices at 67. Yeah.
We had somebody comment that they had a delicious experience some years ago at your Chihuly exhibit.
Oh, I wonder if that's in the Cole Center. Over in our sort of big athletic facility, we had Chihuly sculptures that are hanging from the ceiling. Unfortunately, we've never had those at Monona Terrace, but I wonder if that's where they saw them, because they're wonderful.
This is a specific question to Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, are there plans you can buy to build his houses? If you buy the plans, must you build the house exactly as the plans are? Can you make changes to those plans? Do you know anything about that?
The structures that have gone up that I sort of referred to at the end of the presentation have been mostly public structures. For instance, a golf resort in Reno and a boathouse in Buffalo. I'm not quite so sure about how the residences work, but you would need to go to the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. They're based in Scottsdale, Arizona. And you'd have to go through a process with them but I think, you know, people have engaged with them about doing it. So it's not impossible to do.
In Taliesin, how many bedrooms were there? Do you know?
So there, in the main living quarters on the floor that Wright lived himself with Mama later, I didn't get into marriages and relationships at all, because that's its own presentation, but he would have, you know, also raised a daughter there. There are 3 bedrooms, but then there were also a series of guest rooms down below. He had visitors, and he would, so, you know, I'm not sure of the exact amount, but I think about 6.
And the houses, his houses that are designed up, you know, surrounding Monona, Taliesin, what were the costs of those houses in 1938?
Oh, so when I showed the slide of some of those residences,
Gilmore, Lamp.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know the price tags on the Gilmore lamp, but I can tell you, because of the fact that Wright was trying to meet a certain budget with the Jacobs house, that was a $5,000 project.
What is your favorite Frank Lloyd Wright house, site, project?
Oh, that's always a fun question. I have had the opportunity to see a few. I'm sure it wouldn't surprise you to know that there's kind of a Frank Lloyd Wright nerd conference that happens every year, and anybody can attend. It's usually scholars and homeowners and just enthusiasts like myself. And we went to San Francisco one year and took, you know, like a bus out to some of the Marin County area residences he designed. So there were some beautiful mountainside Usonian houses he designed there that were just gorgeous and really kind of funky geometry. So, you know, hexagons and triangles and so forth. So yeah, very fun.
What was his why geometry, circles, or, you know, what drew him to those particular styles?
Well, Wright says himself that some of that came from his play with Freuble blocks and the fact that he had spent a lot of time as a kid just working with these designs that Freuble had sort of put in front of kids to emulate. And then I think that he saw the opportunity to create beautiful things out of simple shapes. So again, you know, he was not going to look at ornament in the same way that some of his colleagues were, you know, classical style buildings, European based. And he just thought that in his mind, if you can take a shape and repeat it over and over in a floor plan and then later in furnishings and so forth, you're accomplishing a really beautiful environment. So.
Fantastic. Heather, I can't thank you enough. Megan, thank you for connecting us. I just wanted to remind everybody that we have some more Frank Lloyd Wright programming coming up in June and July. You can visit our website at jccchicago.org. There's a full listing of everything that's going on Channel J. Again, Heather, thank you so much. This was fascinating. We really appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.